If you work out the cost per kilo of nitrogen for your CAN and urea at current day prices, there's roughly €1 per kilo in the difference.
Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. Tillage farmers are once again in the middle of a price-cost squeeze with high fertiliser prices and grain close to 25% lower than last year. The major costs on farms tend to be machinery, land and of course fertilisers. The cost of phosphate and potash is substantially higher than last year, with nitrogen close to being the most expensive it's ever been. However, there are hints that the price of nitrogen is easing, but this may not be quick enough for the current growing season. There is currently a large differential in the cost of nitrogen sources, and this may well steer farmers' use this year. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Richie Hackett from Teagasc to chat about the use of CAN or urea as a farmer's main nitrogen source for this year. Richie, just talking about the large price differential between CAN and urea, do you have any idea why this is the case in 2023?
Well, I suppose, Michael, urea is always that little bit cheaper than CAN, but the difference is much bigger this year maybe than in previous years. I'm no expert in international fertiliser markets, but my understanding is that CAN is largely a European product and a lot of it is made in Europe or Russia, where gas prices were very high last back end when the fertiliser was being made, whereas urea is made all around the world. So and it could be made in places where the gas price perhaps wasn't quite as high. So I suspect that has a large part to play in the big difference that's involved this year. And obviously we would have heard back in the back end of last year about CAN factories across Europe that are either working on part-time or not at all, which would have decreased the supply. And if you have lower supply, you'll tend to have higher prices as well.
Okay, and I suppose we do have to, I suppose, bear in mind that fertilizer isn't just made a month in advance, it's probably made 6 months or even 8 months in advance. So it takes a while for that to come through the system. As you rightly say, the high cost of gas back then certainly works into the system. But when it comes to today, just in general terms, in terms of the differential between the price of a kilo of CAN versus the price of a kilo of urea, where does that stand at the moment? And if you were to maybe pull that out in terms of a typical farmer maybe switching from CAN to urea, what sort of cost would that work out on over, say, a larger block of land? Let's just say 100 acres of land.
Yeah, well, I suppose if you work out the cost per kilo of nitrogen for your CAN and urea at current day prices, there's roughly €1 per kilo in the difference. So it depends obviously what price you bought your fertilizer at, but if we take CAN, say at about €810 a ton, that would work out at €3 a kilo for every kilo of nitrogen. And if we take urea at say 920 euros a ton, that would work out at €2 a kilo of nitrogen. So that's a very substantial difference. In terms of what that would add up to in a block of land, as you said, 100 acres, 40 hectares. If you take a crop of winter wheat that maybe we're putting on 230 kilos per hectare, now you probably wouldn't put it all on as CAN or urea. You might put, say, 50 of it on as a compound or something like that. So you'd be putting 180 on as maybe CAN or urea, and you work out the effect of that euro a kilo of nitrogen difference in price on the overall farm cost of fertilizer. You'd be looking at over €7,000 for that 100-acre farm, which is a very substantial difference in costs. So it obviously means that growers really do need to at least consider urea as an option for this season.
Holy moly! I hope people are really listening to that. $7,000 over 100 acres. That is a substantial amount of money. Now, people might be listening to that and kind of thinking, yeah, I know it's $7,000, but Jesus, I've used this stuff in the past and maybe hasn't been as effective. And, we'll get into spreading difficulties in a minute, but are we relatively happy that urea and CAN work pretty much in the same way and as effective, and a grower can expect putting on the same amount of units of each, that the yields will be similar?
Yes and no. It depends. There's two types of urea available on the market at the moment. There's sort of normal, what I would call normal unprotected urea, and then there is protected urea, which is urea that has been treated with an inhibitor that makes it more effective. And if we're comparing the can with the protected urea, then we would be happy that there's no difference between the two. But I suppose one of the issues with normal urea is that normal urea isn't immediately available to the plant. It has to be broken down into ammonium and nitrate in the soil. And during that process, some of the nitrogen can be lost to the air as ammonia. And under particular conditions, quite a substantial amount of the nitrogen can be lost. So, 20-30% isn't uncommon. It doesn't happen every time, but there's that risk present. And if you do lose some of the nitrogen from the unprotected urea, then it's not going to be as effective as can. It can't really be as effective as can if some of the nitrogen has gone off in the air. So what I would say is that the protected urea, the urea with the inhibitor on it, is every bit as good as can. But the unprotected urea, there is that risk. There is that risk there with it in terms of you do stand a chance of losing some of that nitrogen from the unprotected urea.
Okay, so you're going to get similar yields, but you mentioned there that there's a protection on the urea, or you can buy it with the protectors on it. Does the protecting bit, does that slow down the workability of urea? Because you've also mentioned that urea breaks down into ammonia and nitrate. How, by the time it all breaks down, are we kind of losing time, I suppose, in a growing season? Is that not going to work as fast as it can?
No, it will work slower, and that's the whole point of the inhibitor, is to slow down the breakdown process. But that's not really an issue from a crop point of view, because if we go out today and put on fertilizer today, the crop isn't going to take up all that fertilizer tomorrow. It's going to take it up over the next 2, 3, 4 weeks. So it doesn't need all that fertilizer immediately, and it's probably an advantage that it's actually breaking down a little bit slower, and that it'll feed the crop that little bit more evenly, if you like. So yeah, I wouldn't see urea as a slow release fertilizer. So the breakdown process starts as soon as the granule dissolves on the ground, and you have some of that nitrogen becoming available quite quickly. And with the protected urea, it will continue to be released over a period of time. So the urea isn't prevented from breaking down into the plant available types. It's just slowed down.
Okay, so I suppose farmers can have this on both sides. Maybe a little bit applying urea onto very dry ground, or even can onto very dry ground. You can often see certainly you can see with can the granules on the ground. If it's very dry for 3, even 4 weeks, you can still see a little bit of that granule on the ground. Is that a worry with urea if it goes onto really dry ground, say onto maybe a bit of a dusty kind of ground with spring barley, say, coming up, and it's sitting there almost in dust? Is that a worry?
Yeah, well, one of the problems with the urea is that, as I said, some of the nitrogen can be lost, and the risk factors for that are if you put it more so onto a wet soil that dries out. That's the real risk factor. If you put it onto a dry soil and it doesn't actually dissolve, it can't actually be lost. It's only when it dissolves and starts to break down that's when the loss occurs. So putting it onto a moist soil that's going to dry out quite quickly, that's your real high risk scenario. Other risk factors would be perhaps higher pH soils will tend to increase the risk a little bit, but it's not a huge effect because the breakdown process itself actually increases the pH quite significantly just immediately around the granule. It doesn't have any effect on your overall soil pH, but just immediately around the granule, the soil pH is increased as the granule breaks down. So you have drying conditions, you have maybe higher pH is a bit of a risk. Higher temperatures can be an issue as well in terms of increasing the risk, and also lighter soils will tend to be more at risk than heavier soils. If you're using unprotected urea where you've no protection, one of the ways that you can reduce the risk of loss is if there's some rain coming. Now, not torrential heavy rain, but 5 to 10 mils in the days after you put on the unprotected urea, that will actually take it into the soil, wash it into the soil, and then that will tend to reduce the risk of loss of nitrogen into the air. And there will be farmers out there that will have purchased unprotected urea maybe in the back end, and they will be wondering how best to use that. And that's probably a tip that they can use. But if you have the option, if you're only buying it now, then it would make more sense to buy the protected urea, and you don't have any risks.
Don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review, and follow on Apple Podcast or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And on the other side of that, Richie, then, is it, if conditions turn out to be very wet, of course, which they can do in some years, is urea any safer in the soil than CAN?
There's not a huge difference. So there was some work done measuring nitrate leaching from urea and CAN, and there was sort of a small trend towards lower losses of nitrate from urea, but it wasn't actually significant. So it's not really an issue. There's not a lot of difference between the two, and where the differences did show up were in the autumn winter period after you've put on the fertilizer, not necessarily during the growing period, which is when you're worried about as a grower. And generally, when we're putting on our fertilizer in the growing period, the soil, there's never really water flowing down through the soil and out of the soil. Any water that's coming in is being evaporated off by the crop or by the atmosphere. So you're not really getting leaching in most years. Now there will obviously be the odd occasional year where you get a really wet March or April where you may have some leaching, but in general, there would be no great difference between the two, between urea and CAN in terms of leaching in most instances.
All right, and going into specific maybe premium markets, the likes of malt and barley growers, of which they have a very set way of doing things, and and if it works to a degree, many would argue don't change it kind of thing. But if a malt and barley grower was going to switch across to urea, do you think they'll see any different results, or would you be happy enough that once used properly with protected urea, that everything should be fine?
Yeah, well, we've done a good few trials. I've done a good few here in Oak Park, and so my colleagues in Johnstown Castle have done trials comparing CAN and protected urea on spring barley. And what we've found is, in terms of yield, no difference between the protected urea and the CAN. And then the other thing, obviously, malting barley growers would be interested in is the protein levels. And generally, on average, there's no difference in protein levels either. Sometimes, the protected urea can be a little bit higher, and by a little bit, I'm talking maybe 0.2 or 0.3% higher. And sometimes it can be a little bit lower than CAN, 0.2 or 0.3 lower. So on average, there's no great difference. That the plant sees both the protected urea and the CAN as being the same thing.
So for farmers maybe in the past, Richie, they might have used urea, they may well have some reservations about using urea due to the potential of not spreading it probably as well as they might have spread CAN in the past. Is there any kind of tips that you might have that farmers can use so that they can try and get it as even as possible?
Yeah, well, for somebody that hasn't used urea on crops before, that's the key thing to look into before you actually go spreading urea, is to first of all make sure that the machine you have is capable of spreading urea at whatever tramlet widths you're working at. So if you're working at 24 meters, you need to make sure that your machine will actually do that. Then the second thing is to look up what settings are required for your particular machine. So some spreaders will need different vanes to spread urea. Some of them will need the vanes at different angles, or it might be different speeds. There's a range of different settings that are specific to urea, and if you go and use the same settings as you're using for CAN type products with urea, you can get very poor spreadability, and you can end up with stripes in your crops, and that's obviously nobody wants to see that. And so I would urge all growers, if they're going to use urea for the first time, that you check that their spreader is set up properly. Now, obviously, the width that you're spreading at is hugely important. So urea is a lot lighter than CAN. It's less dense, so it's about 80% the density. So the wider you go, the bigger the challenge becomes. So for growers that might be still on 12 meters or maybe 15-meter trams, they probably won't have any great difficulty in spreading urea type products. But once you go above that, you really do need to make sure that your machine is set up. And I suppose the other thing you need to be really careful of is if you're using some of the urea products that have another nutrient in there, so urea with potassium or urea with sulfur. They're often blends of two different fertilizers, of a blend with normal straight urea and maybe some potash fertilizer or some sulfur fertilizer that are different densities, and that can be a real challenge to spread those evenly, because you're trying to throw something with two different weights. It's often the analogy that's often drawn is you're trying to throw a golf ball and a ping pong ball. If you throw them with the same force, you expect the golf ball to go that little bit further. So what can happen with those type products is that the heavier product can go to the further away from the tractor, and the lighter product stays near the tractor. And even though you might be spreading the granules evenly, you get uneven spreading of the nutrients. So those blends, you need to be very careful with spreading those.
Okay, so it's really careful calibration end of the fertilizer spinner and getting out to measure that in the field as well. Both of those are equally as important. You mentioned sulfur there actually in the way by. Can I ask you about that? Because if a grower was, obviously most crops do need a certain amount of sulfur, and we'll come to that in a second. But if a grower is maybe reluctant in taking your advice on board there, and reluctant to use those blended products, wants to use urea on its own, how or what's the best way then to combine the sulfur or getting the sulfur out in the crop? Because I suppose, look, in the past, there would have been lots of products like, CAN plus sulfur. So you would have been kind of getting both of them out at the same time.
Yeah, well, that can be an issue with urea when you're using urea as your main nitrogen source, but there are ways around it. Some people will use a compound with sulfur in it, and that will get at least some of their sulfur, maybe all their sulfur, depending on the compound that they're using. Then there's the possibility of using other fertilizers that have sulfur in it, so the likes of sulfate of ammonia or ASN. So those two products can supply your sulfur reasonably economically. And then you have other products that are more or less specific sulfur fertilizers, the likes of kieserite or polysulfate, which can supply your sulfur as well. So there are a number of ways of getting the sulfur on. It just requires a little bit more thought than, say, using your normal sulfate can or something like that. But it can be done.
Okay, plenty of options out there, but I suppose maybe the key word there is to make sure that you don't wait for the last minute, because probably some of those products that you talked about there, the likes of ammonium sulfate and kieserite or polysulfate, that mightn't be in all merchants' yards at all times. So you might have to order those in maybe. So just be aware of that as well. Just Richie, one question there as regards to, is there any timing difference between when you might apply urea versus CAN, or look, they're going to pretty much work pretty much the same and same time as it will work out?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't see any reason to change your timings. As I say, the urea becomes available relatively quickly to the crop. It's often thought of as a slow release fertilizer, but it actually breaks down reasonably quickly. So, and it'll break down more quickly than the crop actually can take it up, particularly for early applications. So I wouldn't see any reason to make any drastic changes to your timings.
Okay.
I suppose one thing that growers might be conscious of is, if you're using unprotected urea, the later you go with your splits, the more likely you are to hit those drying conditions that I mentioned are increasing your risk of loss. But if you're using the protected urea, then that's not really an issue at all.
Richie, just in terms of that loss, if a grower made a bit of a hames of it, or just got stuck or whatever, and ended up applying in the worst of all conditions, what would be the potential loss from an application of urea?
Well, I suppose in terms of kilos of nitrogen, if you were, you could look in terms of percentage, you could look, as I said, maybe 20-30%, or in real extreme conditions, it can actually be more than that, but normally it wouldn't be. But sort of normal losses with, again, all this is with unprotected urea, 10 to 15% wouldn't be uncommon. And in terms of yield, then it's difficult to put a figure on it, but we've often shown yield reductions of half to a ton per hectare, that sort of ballpark. But it really depends on how much nitrogen you do lose, if you do lose it at all.
So try and avoid those conditions. Really, that's the key word there. Final one I want to ask you, Richie, is around I suppose the spend on nitrogen this year is going to be quite large, even if you're using urea. And I suppose given the fact that the price of grain, or the selling price of grain, is probably off maybe 25%, 80 to 80 euros a ton, or maybe a little bit somewhere thereabouts. Very much a price cost squeeze at the moment. In terms of maximizing the return for every kilo of nitrogen, should growers be thinking about reducing the overall nitrogen so that they maximize that return?
They should, but I suppose the tricky bit is working out exactly how much they should do it, because it really depends on the relative fertilizer, the relative nitrogen cost, and the grain price that they're going to get. And many growers may not know their nitrogen cost yet, and they probably almost definitely won't know their grain cost, or the grain value they're going to sell their grain at harvest. And you really need both of those to get an accurate figure. But sort of the numbers that we are looking at the minute, with current predicted green grain prices and current fertilizer prices, you'd be looking at reducing anything between maybe about 15 kilos per hectare, where you have using a cheaper version of nitrogen, maybe right up to 40 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, where you have expensive fertilizer that's costing you maybe €3 a kilo. So it's quite a big range, and it's really difficult to give an accurate number, because we don't really know what the grain price is going to be, and the fertilizer market is obviously changing quite rapidly as well. So it's difficult to give a definite answer.
Certainly lots to think about there, and I suppose every advisor out there will have a bit of a ready reckoner table for when people kind of get closer to that. And I think we were discussing it before, Richie, whereby it might be towards the last application of nitrogen, whether it's on some of the barleys or the winter wheats, that you might consider that final decision whether you use less at that stage.
We saw that from last year. A lot of people decided to reduce their fertilizer at the first, when they were starting, but then as grain price increased, they were able to go back in and put on a little bit more, and that option is still there this year as well, to delay the decision. You don't have to make that decision today, you can make it a bit later on in the season.
Richie, delighted to get that information. I think you've given farmers a huge amount to think about. And certainly not just to think about from their pocket, but from machinery and some operations as well. So again, thanks very much for your time, and look, we'll have you back again. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Richie for joining me on the podcast. Don't forget to go along to one of the remaining winter crop walks, which continue this week in Dublin, Kilkenny, Kildare and Donegal, to hear the latest about fertiliser, herbicide and fungicide advice for winter crops this year. For more information, go to teagasc.ie/tillage month. Finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.